I think that a lot of people should stop and realize is that no ethnic community is a monolith. There isn't like an African American viewpoint. There's lots of different ones.
During the Civil Rights Movement, these different African American viewpoints translated into many different forms of activism. Each form was motivated by different ideas and had different pros and cons. Hold on, you might say. Why does this matter? Why should I keep listening? It matters because we can learn from the past and use it to make better decisions in the future. For example, researching African American activism during the Civil Rights Movement can help us better plan activist movements today. But first we need to actually learn from the past. To decide how to organize a social movement, we need to analyze the types of social movements in the past and how effective they were. Therefore, for my project, I explored this research question. Which forms of activism were most effective in causing a change in the lives of African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement and why? Now, let's get right into it. From my in-depth analysis of this topic, I've concluded that, although the use of violence was sometimes necessary for self-defense, it was nonviolent protests that contributed most to long-term change in the Civil Rights Movement. When violent government reactions to these peaceful protests were televised, the nation's opinion on the Civil Rights Movement shifted, prompting civil rights acts and leading to better lives for African Americans. To better organize the effectiveness of civil rights demonstrations, I grouped them into three major categories: separatist movements, violent movements, and nonviolent movements. The separatist movements followed the ideas of Booker T. Washington, who wanted African Americans to tolerate segregation and work on improving themselves, being separate but contributing members of a whole society.
So you have Marcus Garvey and the United Negro Improvement Association. That's not focused on legal, it's focused mainly on economic separatism. So, black businesses in black neighborhoods for black customers, owned by black men, black women. That's kind of the idea behind Marcus Garvey, if you can't, and other people like him who maybe didn't want to go back to Africa but did believe in the separatism part and wanted to make their own kind of self-sustaining black communities with their own economies so that they wouldn't have to interact with whites or depend on whites for anything. The Nation of Islam becomes the inheritors of Garvey.
This type of movement reminds me of Huck Finn in Mark Twain's novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. In the novel, Huck Finn is constantly annoyed at the numerous social norms imposed on him by his foster family. When he's told about going to heaven and hell, he says he wished he was in hell, because he wanted to go somewhere where there was a change, and he didn't have to follow social norms anymore. This is similar to separatist ideas. Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey did not believe in fighting segregation, and instead wanted to become successful independently. Similarly, Huck Finn didn't fight the social norms that were imposed on him, but instead strove to become independent of them someplace else. Although this movement did allow many African Americans to become successful and live relatively safer lives, it didn't really cause long-term change, so we won't be focusing on it much. Then, there were nonviolent protests, which are some of the most well-known today. These were most often coordinated by big organizations, uniting numerous African Americans for a specific movement.
The NAACP, for example, is mostly a legal-minded organization that will help a lot of black defendants who can't afford lawyers and thus would be railroaded by a racist judicial system, maybe get a little bit of legal help. And the NAACP are also going to be the people who are going to bring lawsuits against the government, challenging segregation. Stuff like Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which ultimately overturned segregation. The NAACP has a huge role in bringing that lawsuit, so they're a legal organization. Then in the 50s and 60s, you see new groups pop up. The most interesting ones are student-led. So one is called SNCC. So that's black college students and white college students who are both going to take part in activism during the 60s. Things like freedom rides and sit-ins and stuff like that.
Finally, there were more violent movements, like the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party, and race riots in general.
Black Power is mostly young African Americans in the 60s and 70s who they see Martin Luther King as just a little bit too nice. They don't like turn the other cheek. They're like, screw that. If somebody's gonna hit me, if some racist's gonna hit me, I'm gonna hit him back. You know, they kind of rejected the theory of nonviolence that Martin Luther King and his organization furthered.
Let's first explore the effectiveness of nonviolent movements.
It's well-known march. It was called the Million Man March, and it was led by, again, Louis Farrakhan, who's the minister of the Nation of Islam, and a leader of the Nation of Islam. And his goal, he wanted to assemble a million African black men, just men, on the mall in Washington, D.C. And it was cast as an atonement gathering. That the purpose of it was to get African American men together and to start to work together more with each other, atone for those things where we had not been up to par in terms of, in some cases, fathers in our homes, and just to begin to love each other and be peaceable amongst each other. And so I was there that day, and out there with it was a million men out there. It was crowded. It was everything, and it was extremely peaceful. There were no incidents, and so, but just being there, being a part of it, being a part of that atmosphere, being that many folk men that didn't know each other or coming up and hugging each other and giving conversation and wishing each other well, and listening to a number of speeches by all sorts of leaders in the African American community. So it was a full day.
This was Mr. McManus's reflection on a nonviolent protest he participated in, the Million Man March. Mr. McManus also participated in violent protests, like a race riot occurring after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
Friends and I went up to the area where they were rioting, but to be quite honest, I got there and saw all the bad activity that was going on, fires and windows and all that breaking out. I turned around and went home. Plus, my mother was furious.
Another important aspect of violent protests that we must consider is that of self-defense. Many African Americans, even those who actively participated in non-violent protests, resorted to self-defense to protect themselves and their communities from racial violence. Activist organizations also had to be armed and ready to protect their demonstrators in the event of mob attacks. No matter how effective these violent strategies were at long-term change, they were crucial for saving African American lives during the Civil Rights Movement. Now let's actually compare these types of activism and see which ones are more effective. Naturally, I went to a bunch of history teachers and asked them for their opinion. Mr. Anderson?
Success is a hard measure. I mean, obviously, the nonviolent movement worked in the sense that you were able to desegregate, right? But it's kind of an oversimplification because success is a hard thing to measure, right? So they were successful in desegregating. If they were successful in equality, it's an entirely different conversation.
Surely Mr. Weinberg has a definite answer, right? Mr. Weinberg?
I can't say. I think it, to an extent, it still remains to be seen because I don't believe the civil rights issue has been solved yet.
Mm-hmm.
So in order for me to say one method was particularly effective, I would have to say, well, it led to the end of it. And none of them have. So I would say none of them, in a sense.
Of course, as history teachers, they'd have no definite answer. But I disagree. Even if the civil rights issue hasn't been solved yet, there have definitely been major successes, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was definitely motivated by some forms of activism more than others. And even if success is hard to define, it can be difficult to evaluate their effects. Like, we can tell that because of armed self-defense, there was less racial violence in African American communities. We we should also be able to tell what each form of activism was able to accomplish. When analyzing the reactions of the public to nonviolent and violent protests, we can see that the general population tended to support the nonviolent side. For example, when the state governments were using violence against peaceful protesters, there was a lot of support for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. However, when more violent protests began right after, voters switched to the Republican Party. This was why the underlying goal of nonviolent protest was to elicit a violent reaction from state governments, in hopes that it would be televised and would help raise awareness for the issue.
I think that is one of the primary things about awareness, is that you're trying to get enough people on your side so that when you're mobilizing, right, you have a lot of backing. One big thing about the civil rights movement in the 1960s is part of the reason why, if you think about southern cities or like powder keg, and so essentially these protests are like lighting a flame to it. So, you show up, you protest, you know that you're gonna get a reaction, essentially, like they're gonna stick dogs, you can do whatever. And so that is all getting filmed on national media. So now nationally you're seeing this, internationally seeing this, and that applies pressure, right, to those in power, at least in theory it will, in the response to that. Civil rights movement certainly did. I mean, you had RFK come down and ask SNCC to stop the freedom rides because it was making them look bad internationally, right? So, and they said no. So you have those kinds of things. You have the Montgomery campaign getting blasted and people worldwide, and people are seeing children getting hosed and bit by dogs, right? So that moves people to want change to happen.
What tipped the balance for a lot of Americans to be in support of civil rights was watching on the news those German shepherds biting people on the streets just for protesting, or the fire hoses blasting kids across the street, or when they walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and the police run through with horses and hitting old church women on the head with billy clubs. Those images of black nonviolent protesters contrasted with white racist violence, that helped tip the scales. And it helped convince enough people in Congress and across America to be in support of those laws.
Ever since I was a child, I've always wondered why people engage in violent protests. Not only are you committing a crime, but you're also tarnishing your group's reputation. The only way I could justify people engaging in violent protests was that they were more effective. However, my research this past school year has shown that during the civil rights movement, although the use of violence was sometimes necessary for self-defense, it was non-violent protests that contributed most to long-term change in the civil rights movement. When violent government reactions to these peaceful protests were televised, the nation's opinion on the civil rights movement shifted, prompting civil rights acts and leading to better lives for African Americans. This shows that violent protests have almost nothing going for them, except maybe negative publicity. It reminds me of the business concept known as a loss leader, a product whose sole purpose is to attract publicity and thereby sell other products. Except there is no other product in a violent protest. Thank you so much for watching my multimedia essay on African American activism. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new.